Now the development section erupts with that famous crash. And Tchaikovsky begins to develop his first theme. You remember it? By making a fugue-like passage out of it, but in doing so, he employs as his counter-subject, you guessed it, a scale. This whole fugato, in fact, is built on climbing scale motion. But at the climax, the descending scale takes over. One could go on this way, finding endless uses of the scale throughout the movement, but I think the point is already clear enough. Let us only note the ostinato scale, played by the plucked strings at the close of the movement, as a kind of tranquil final statement under a brass chorale. And so on to the end of the movement. Now one would think that Tchaikovsky had really exploited the device of scales to his satisfaction and that of the hearer. But no, he has only begun. In the remaining three movements, he uses scales constantly, not only as figuration, but for themes themselves. In fact, the second movement begins immediately with a charming melody in 5/4 time, built out of ascending and descending major scales. Later, he accompanies the already scaly theme with faster scales pizzicato. For the middle section of this song form movement, he builds a contrasting, languishing melody, again out of a simple descending scale over a repeated timpani beat. The coda of this movement is almost an exercise in scales, descending ones of a sustained nature in the winds against climbing ones more flowing in the strings. Jumping now to the famous third movement, the great march that always draws applause from the audience, even though the symphony is not yet finished, we find scales rushing, careening, whistling, and flying throughout the movement. Here are a few instances. In the very first theme, the fourth bar is made of two swooping scales. Here is the theme in the orchestra. Later, he uses that scale this way. Now notice the descending scale that accompanies the new theme. Then the veritable hurricane of scales at the climax. and the grand finale of scales at the end of the movement. If this is beginning to sound to you like a symphony of scales, you must remember that I am picking out only the passages relevant to the point I am making, and rather than condemn Tchaikovsky for his primitive materials, we should admire and praise him for the ingenuity with which he handles it in diverse ways.